Hey guys, tonight we step into the torchlit corridors of forgotten palaces where the walls glitter with mosaics and the air smells like roasted lamb mixed with incense that's maybe been burning for way too many hours. You shuffle forward, your slippers scuffing the tiled floors polished by centuries of servants, and you can almost hear the faint hum of 1,000 lives hidden behind golden doors. You're not just sightseeing, you're about to slip into the strange, shimmering world of kings who somehow managed to keep not 10, not 20, but well over 100 wives. And just a fair warning, you probably wouldn't survive this lifestyle. The noise alone would finish you off before breakfast. Before you get comfortable. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push past the first heavy curtain and suddenly the palace opens up like a theatre stage. Flickering torches line the colonnades, making bronze statues look alive. The flames cast shadows that stretch across ivory walls carved with hunting scenes. And there, right in front of you, is the grand spectacle. A king seated on a raised throne, flanked by guards in silk uniforms, and surrounding him, just casually fanning themselves, are wives upon wives dressed in embroidered gowns that sparkle like liquid stars. You gulp. Managing a single group chat feels overwhelming. Managing this crowd, absolutely impossible. Yet somehow the king makes it look like part of his job description. The first thing you realize is that this setup isn't just about romance or desire. Nope, it's about power projection. Having 100 wives was like ancient flexing, kind of the medieval version of showing off an absurdly expensive car collection. Except instead of horsepower, you had human alliances. Kings flaunted these women in festivals, coronations, or nighttime court banquets, not necessarily to brag about love, but to remind everyone in the room, look how many people depend on me, look how much wealth I control. Mainstream history gives you some iconic examples. The Mughal Emperor Akbar in India, for instance, is believed to have had hundreds of wives and concubines, many of them princesses from different regions. His harem wasn't just for pleasure, it was a literal map of political loyalty. Each wife represented a family, a kingdom, a region he had pulled into his orbit. Imagine Tinder, but every swipe comes with a treaty-attached dot. You take another step and hear the distant sounds of a fountain splashing in a courtyard. The water echoes in the night, and you picture women seated around it, whispering, laughing, maybe plotting their next move in the endless chess game of survival. This palace isn't a home, it's a universe, and at its center, the king is the sun. Everything revolves around him. If he smiles, people eat. If he frowns, people starve. That much power radiates through the very tiles under your feet. But here's a quirky tidbit that makes you chuckle. Some palaces literally had rotating beds. Yup. In certain Islamic courts, engineers designed mechanical platforms that could spin gently, supposedly to keep the king cool or to change the scenery around him. Imagine lying down and the entire room slowly pirouettes like a theme park ride. Historians still argue whether these rotating contraptions were practical or just royal over-engineering. Either way, you can't help but think, so the man had 100 wives and a rotating bed. Who was he trying to impress? His guests or NASA? And you? You shuffle past a row of women's slippers neatly arranged on a carpet. The pairs stretch on like an endless shoe store aisle. You whisper to yourself, okay, Cinderella's ball had nothing on this. Still, not everything about this world was glamorous. The torchlight also reveals tension. Behind the smiles and laughter, jealousy simmers. Some wives are pampered favourites, sitting closer to the king's throne. Others linger at the edge, forgotten, their jewels catching less firelight. The king may seem like the conductor of this orchestra, but you can sense the dissonant notes. 100 women, each with her own ambitions, fears and grudges. It's not so much a love story as it is a powder keg wrapped in silk. Historians still argue whether kings truly had time for all these wives. Some scholars suggest the hundreds might be symbolic exaggerations, a way to glorify rulers by inflating numbers. Others insist the numbers were real, backed by records of servants, expenses, and palace architecture designed to house that many people. Either way, you glance at the enormous courtyard and think, even if the records are half true, that's still enough drama to fuel 1,000 Netflix series. A servant carrying a tray of spiced wine passes by you. You imagine what it took to keep this machine running. Cooks preparing endless feasts, tailors sewing robes, musicians rehearsing lullabies for royal sleep. The palace wasn't just home, it was a 24/7 economy orbiting around one man's lifestyle choices. And honestly, if kings had Yelp reviews back then, most would probably say, "Great palace, 5 stars, but way too noisy at night." As you sink into a plush cushion near the edge of the hall, the flickering torches begin to lull your eyes. You realize that this palace spectacle was designed not only to dazzle guests, but to hypnotize them, keep them staring at the wealth, the wives, the power, and they'll forget to notice the cracks in the empire's walls. In a way, the 100 wives were more than companions. They were part of a giant illusion, a living billboard flashing, "This king is untouchable." You exhale, the smell of rosewater perfume tickling your nose, and think of your own bed back home. Suddenly, the soft hum of your fan doesn't seem so dull. Compared to juggling hundreds of royal egos, one pillow and a quiet night feels like the ultimate luxury. The torches burn lower, shadows stretching longer, and your eyelids drift. You're only at the beginning of this journey, but already you can feel how strange, how overwhelming, and how deeply human this forgotten world of royal harems truly was. You lean back against that cushion a little longer, your eyes still catching the last flickers of torchlight across the throne room, and suddenly it dawns on you. These women aren't here because a king was unusually romantic or hopelessly addicted to candle-lit dinners. No, most of them are here because of politics, pure and simple. Each jeweled anklet, each embroidered sleeve isn't just an accessory, it's a treaty stitched in silk. You realize with a slow exhale that marriage, for kings, was less about love stories and more about building human chessboards. And every queen or consort you see lounging nearby is essentially a living piece on that board. Take a step closer and you overhear 2 courtiers gossiping. They're whispering about how last week a princess from a neighboring kingdom arrived in the palace, her wedding less a celebration and more of a signed contract. The dowry wasn't just gold, it was a promise of troops in case the empire needed soldiers. You suddenly picture it, a king marrying not for affection but for armor, swords, and fortified borders. If Tinder bios existed in this era, you suspect they'd read something like, "Looking for long-term stability must come with 20,000 cavalry." One mainstream historical fact jumps at you here. In medieval India, Mughal emperors often sealed alliances through marriage. Akbar famously married Rajput princesses to secure loyalty from powerful Hindu clans. These unions weren't secret trysts, they were public spectacles designed to show subjects that peace was being brokered with silk veils instead of spears. It's almost comical. One royal wedding could do what 10 battles couldn't, tie 2 enemies into one very awkward family gathering. As you wander past a mosaic of 2 peacocks facing each other, you can't help but notice how deliberate it all feels. Even the art screams symbolism. Wives weren't just spouses. They were walking treaties. They stood as constant reminders that if one region rebelled, well, the king's in-laws were right there in the harem, probably sipping pomegranate juice and gossiping about the latest scandal. It's one thing to rebel against a ruler, but it's another to rebel when your cousin, sister, or daughter is married into his bedchamber. Talk about complicated family dinners. Here comes the quirky tidbit that makes you grin. In certain courts, when a new wife arrived, she would bring with her a parade of food unique to her homeland. Spices, recipes, sometimes entire kitchens of chefs. This meant kings could end up with harems that doubled as international buffets. You imagine a king strolling into his chambers at night and thinking, do I want Persian dates, Turkish coffee, or Indian curry with my bedtime story tonight? Forget United Nations peacekeepers. This was more like United Kitchens. Of course, the tension was never far away. Marriages for politics didn't guarantee peace in the long run. Some alliances held strong, yes, but others were fragile as glass goblets. Historians still argue whether these marital strategies genuinely worked to stabilize empires, or whether they simply delayed the inevitable rebellions. Sure, marrying a princess might keep her father loyal for a decade, but what happens when her brother decides he wants the throne instead? It's like patching a cracked dam with a silk scarf. It looks nice, but water pressure is relentless. You shuffle further into the harem's outer courtyard, where faint music drifts through carved lattice windows. The wives, or should you say, political ambassadors in disguise, are exchanging stories. One laughs at how her father thought marrying her off would secure farmland. Another sighs, knowing her brother was given a governorship as part of the deal. You can feel it in the air. Every woman here is PA. RT of a grander contract, like pages in a treaty that was never signed with ink, but with veils, prayers, and whispered vows. And there's something sobering about that. You realise that while kings flaunted their harems like trophies, these women were often caught in the machinery of empire. They weren't asked what they wanted, they were sent, exchanged, sometimes as teenagers, sometimes as widows, sometimes as bargaining chips when the treasury was too empty to pay debts. You bite your lip and think about how casually a handshake in today's world compares to the lifelong stakes these women carried. The palace air is heavy with jasmine, but you can't shake the image of treaties wrapped in wedding gowns. You think of medieval Europe for comparison. Kings there couldn't legally take hundreds of wives thanks to church rules, but they still turned marriage into politics. Consider Henry VIII, who married and remarried in a desperate scramble for heirs and alliances. True, he didn't hit the 3-digit wife record, but he certainly proved the point. Royal beds doubled as thrones. Back in the eastern palaces. However, the system was even more structured. The Ottomans, for example, often married women from powerful regions to secure loyalty, though sometimes they preferred concubines without political ties, precisely to avoid messy family politics. That sparks a debate historians still argue about. Was it smarter for kings to marry women from powerful families, risking that their in-laws gained influence, or to choose women from nowhere, ensuring loyalty but missing out on political advantages? You can almost picture medieval rulers pacing in their chambers like reality show contestants. Do I choose the princess with 50,000 troops or the concubine with 0 political baggage? Your feet guide you now through another archway where sunlight filters in faintly, showing a mural of a wedding procession. Drums, elephants, banners, it's all there. The spectacle wasn't just for the palace, it was for the people too. Royal marriages were massive public events, carefully staged to broadcast stability. Seeing the king take a wife from a rival clan was a visible promise that we're friends now, stop sharpening your swords. Of course, whether anyone actually put their swords away is another story entirely. You pause by a marble bench where scribes once sat, recording every detail of these weddings in flowery prose. They didn't describe treaties or negotiations. They described the bride's jewels, the king's turban, the number of elephants in the parade. Yet beneath the glitter, you know the truth. Those lines were documenting the empire's survival strategy. Another thought crosses your mind, more sarcastic than solemn. If modern kings had tried this today, you can only imagine the headlines: local monarch marries for peace again, wedding number 87, live streamed for political transparency. Hashtags would trend faster than royal processions could march. But back in the medieval courtyard, there is no Wi-Fi, no hashtags, just the soft thud of drums echoing through the palace walls and the quiet knowledge that every union you see around you was less about affection and more about arithmetic. One bride equals one alliance equals fewer soldiers on the battlefield. Fewer soldiers on the battlefield means the king gets to sleep soundly, at least until the next uprising. And as you settle into the shadow of an arch, you realize something both fascinating and a little sad. These harems were never just bedrooms. They were libraries of treaties, museums of politics, archives of empire building. Every wife was a document, every smile a clause, every child a clause extension. The palace didn't just house love stories, it housed the survival manual of entire kingdoms. You're still lingering in the palace courtyard, your head buzzing from the realization that every jeweled bride you've just seen is essentially a treaty in human form. But then, like incense curling up into the rafters, another layer of this world rises to meet you, the spiritual seal of approval. For kings to parade 100 wives without being accused of gluttony, sin, or outright chaos, they needed something bigger than politics backing them. They needed heaven, and heaven, conveniently enough, had its spokespeople: priests, monks, imams, shamans, take your pick depending on the kingdom. You hear them murmuring in torchlit corridors, their voices a mix of blessing, poetry, and spin-doctoring. Step quietly into the echoing temple chamber attached to the palace. The marble floor chills your feet, and rows of priests stand in ceremonial robes, chanting. You notice how their words carefully stitch together scripture and royal policy, as if God himself had drawn up the marriage contracts. One mainstream fact echoes here. In the Islamic empires, including the Ottomans and Mughals, polygamy was explicitly allowed under Sharia law, though technically capped at 4 wives. The catch? Kings argued that as God's chosen rulers, their status exempted them, or they simply blurred the line by calling most of their women concubines instead of wives. You squint, realizing it's basically a divine loophole. If kings were programmers, this was their bug exploit. The smoke of burning sandalwood makes your nose twitch. Priests declare that the king, as a shepherd of his people, must show fertility and abundance. Many wives become proof of that abundance. You think of it like this: if you have 1 apple tree, fine, you're a farmer. If you own a whole orchard, suddenly you're a blessing from the gods. Kings were orchards in human form. And priests, they were the gardeners assuring ever, young the orchard was not excessive but sacred. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some African kingdoms, royal marriages were blessed with bizarre rituals. Among the Shona in what's now Zimbabwe, oral traditions describe priests spitting beer foam onto the couple as a divine blessing. Imagine standing at the altar today, and a priest leans over with a pint of lager, announcing, "May your marriage be frothy and everlasting." You'd laugh, but in the medieval mind, beer foam was as holy as incense smoke. The sound of chanting grows louder. You can't help but wonder, were all priests really on board with this? Historians still argue whether clerical support was universal or coerced. Some records suggest priests genuinely believed a large harem symbolized divine favor. Others hint that dissenting clerics quietly grumbled, rolling their eyes at kings who stretched holy texts like old shoelaces. One whispered complaint in a chronicle suggests a priest muttered, "Sure, the scriptures say 4 wives, but I guess 100 is just really enthusiastic math." As you drift closer to the altar, you spot offerings piled high, baskets of fruit, bolts of silk, even carved elephants. You realize kings weren't just bribing other monarchs with marriage, they were also bribing heaven. Every feast, every offering, every lavish temple festival was part of the spiritual cover story. To the people, the king's many wives weren't signs of excess. They were proof the gods had smiled on their ruler. You can almost hear the sermons. If the king can feed 100 wives, surely he can feed the kingdom. The irony hits you like a soft slap of incense smoke. Regular folks struggled to afford one marriage, dowries included. Meanwhile, the king's polygamy was spun as a virtue. You mutter to yourself, if Netflix existed back then, priests would have had their own spin-off show called Keeping Up with the Concubines. And the kicker, the public would have watched it as religious programming. You step back into the palace corridors, and suddenly you realize something important. This whole system of 100 wives couldn't exist without architecture specifically designed to keep it running. These palaces weren't just homes, they were elaborate machines, stone and marble contraptions carefully constructed to house, entertain, and yes, control hundreds of women. You draw your hand across a wall that feels cool even in the heat of torches, and you realize the space around you is whispering its own story. The first thing you notice is how hidden everything feels. Unlike the grand throne halls, the harem wings are tucked behind labyrinthine corridors and ornate screens. You pass through archways carved so intricately you wonder if the stonemasons got paid by the hour. Latticed windows filter the light into delicate patterns, but they also keep the outside world from peering in. It's all beauty serving a very practical purpose: privacy, or, depending on your perspective, imprisonment. A mainstream fact settles over you here. In the Ottoman Empire, the harem of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul was not only physically separated from the rest of the court, but also fiercely guarded by eunuchs and walls within walls. The design made it nearly impossible for outsiders to access, turning the harem into both a sanctuary and a cage. You imagine walking through Topkapi's long halls, tiles gleaming in blue and white, domes painted with swirling calligraphy, all stunning, but always funneling you inward, deeper into a place you were never meant to leave once you entered. The floors beneath your feet. Here are polished marble, but you sense something else beneath. Layers of intent. These spaces weren't designed for women to roam freely. They were designed to regulate. Gardens inside courtyards meant wives could see the sky but never the city. Pools and fountains offered beauty, but also boundaries, perfectly enclosed. Even when you smell roses blooming along the path, you can't ignore the walls hemming them in. Then comes the quirky tidbit that makes you smirk. In some Indian palaces, harem architecture included whispering galleries, curved walls or domes where sound carried in strange ways. This allowed guards, or perhaps nosy eunuchs, to eavesdrop on conversations from across the room. Picture trying to gossip with your friend about the king's fashion choices, only to realize your whispers have turned into a broadcast radio show. You imagine one eunuch nudging another and saying, "She just said His Majesty's turban looks like a fruit basket." Not exactly private. You take a turn down a narrower hallway, and you feel how claustrophobic it becomes. The architecture itself seems to press the women inward, channeling them toward communal spaces where eyes, royal or otherwise, could always be watching. It makes you think of the famous Mughal harem complexes in Fatehpur Sikri, where Emperor Akbar built entire quarters dedicated to his wives and concubines. The design was elegant: pillared halls, airy courtyards, and even underground passages to manage the flow of people unseen. But beneath the beauty, it all had a clear function: control access to the king, control communication, control movement. Historians still argue whether these harems should be seen primarily as prisons or palaces. Were they spaces of confinement, locking women away from the world? Or were they sanctuaries providing safety, luxury, and even influence within their gilded walls? Some argue that women had real power inside these quarters, shaping politics through whispers and alliances. Others insist that the walls were less about safety and more about making sure royal women stayed where kings wanted them. You glance at the heavy lattice door behind you and think, well, pre-Zoe or Palace, the padlock looks the same. As you keep walking, the sound changes. It's quieter here. Footsteps softened by carpets so thick you feel like you're walking on sponge cake. The air is heavy with perfumes, rose, musk, amber. You can almost hear giggles drifting from behind a silk curtain. It's oddly domestic, like stepping into the world's most luxurious dormitory. Except instead of posters on the wall, there are tapestries of hunting scenes. And instead of cafeteria food, there are trays of jeweled sweets carried by servants who never meet your eyes. You stumble upon an interior courtyard where a fountain gurgles lazily. The moonlight trickles through, painting silver patterns on the water. Around the courtyard are doorways, each leading to private chambers. Imagine being the architect who had to calculate exactly how many bedrooms the king might need. So, Your Majesty, are we planning for 10, 20, or 100 and counting? Better add a few extra, just in case. That must have been one very long blueprint. Here's another detail that makes you pause. Some harems were designed with secret tunnels leading directly to the king's private quarters. This way, he could summon a wife discreetly without parading through public corridors. You smirk, thinking, so basically medieval palaces had their own VIP backdoor system, ancient Uber Eats, but for people instead of kebabs. It's practical, yes, but also chilling. The architecture itself ensured intimacy was never truly private. It was systematized, controlled, and sometimes scheduled. As you move through another hallway, your fingers trace the cool mosaic tiles on the wall. They tell stories, flowers, stars, vines. They're beautiful distractions, but they also feel like masks. Behind the artistry lies the reality of what this architecture was built to enforce. Every wall was a border. Every doorway a checkpoint, every staircase a path that narrowed choices. The space opens into what looks like a music room. Instruments are stacked in the corner, lutes, drums, flutes. You imagine wives gathering here for entertainment, filling the rooms with song and laughter. It almost feels free until you remember the walls outside. The architecture allowed joy, yes, but always within the perimeter of control. Another mainstream fact comes to mind. The Forbidden City in Beijing had entire quarters designated for the emperor's consorts, with strict layouts that determined rank and proximity. The higher your status, the closer your chamber was to the emperor's. The lower your status, the further you were shoved toward the periphery. The floor plan itself became a social hierarchy carved into stone. Imagine your real estate agent today telling you, great news, your rank as third favorite wife gets you an upgrade to the West Wing suite. That's how literal it was. The debate continues in your head. Was this beauty meant to uplift or suppress? You picture historians huddled over blueprints, arguing whether the courtyards symbolized freedom of movement or were simply gilded cages. One scholar might argue that women used these spaces creatively, turning them into centers of learning, poetry, and influence. Another might counter that no matter how pretty the tiles, a locked door is still a locked door. You glance around at the tall walls hemming you in and decide the truth is probably somewhere in between. The more you walk, the more the design feels like a paradox. Gardens bloom inside, but no one can step outside. Fountains sparkle, but they drown out whispers. Windows filter sunlight, but block vision of the city. It's like living in a painting, gorgeous to look at, but two-dimensional. Finally, you enter a chamber lined with cushions and think about how this architecture wasn't just functional, it was psychological. By keeping women together but cut off from the outside, the palace shaped their entire worldview. For some, this meant a world of luxury and security. For others, it meant a gilded loneliness. You can almost hear both the laughter of women trading jokes over tea and the quiet sigh of someone staring at the moon through a lattice window, wondering what lay beyond the palace walls. As you sink onto one of the cushions, you chuckle to yourself. The harem really was a kind of medieval gated community, except the gates weren't just to keep outsiders from coming in, they were to keep insiders from ever leaving. And unlike your local HOA, you couldn't exactly argue about the rules. The torchlight flickers against the ceiling, shadows dancing like ghosts of past whispers. The architecture around you is beautiful, yes, but you can't shake the feeling that every wall is silently reminding you of its true purpose, to keep order in a system that could collapse without it. And as the sound of a distant fountain lulls you, you realize the harem wasn't just a place. It was a structure of power carved into stone. You've been winding through these corridors long enough to notice something else. The harems weren't just built with walls and tiles, they were built with people. Specifically, the ever-watchful guardians who stood between the king's wives and the outside world. You round a corner and nearly bump into one now, tall, robed, sharp-eyed, carrying a ceremonial staff and radiating the kind of authority that says, "Don't even think about trying that door." These are the eunuchs. You've heard the word before, but now you see them in their element, guarding doors, whispering instructions, and controlling access to entire wings of the palace. Their presence feels both intimidating and strangely indispensable, like living locks that also gossiped when no one was looking. Here's your mainstream fact. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs, specifically the black eunuchs brought from Africa, were some of the most powerful figures in Topkapi Palace. They guarded the imperial harem, controlled communications, and sometimes even rose to incredible influence, advising sultans directly. Imagine being a gatekeeper who not only keeps people out but also whispers policy into the king's ear. That's less security guard, more CEO with a side hustle in hallway patrol. You notice how their role worked on multiple levels. First, physical protection. Nobody, not even high-ranking ministers, could walk into the harem without going through them. Second, surveillance. They monitored the wives, the concubines, even the servants. Third, trust. Kings believed eunuchs were safe around women since their altered bodies supposedly erased temptation. You raise an eyebrow. Altered or not, you know human beings don't suddenly lose curiosity, ambition, or opinions. If anything, taking away one avenue of life might just sharpen others. And that's where things get interesting. The quirky tidbit, eunuchs were no-toe, rias for spreading gossip across the palace. With one foot in the harem and another in the outer court, they became the palace's unofficial rumour distribution system. A wife might whisper a secret to her attendant, the attendant murmurs it to a eunuch, and by morning the whole court knows. You imagine a eunuch leaning casually against a marble column saying, "So, apparently the king fell asleep halfway through last night's poetry recital." Boom! Instant meme of the medieval palace. Still comma. You can't help but feel the tension in their existence. Eunuchs weren't born into their roles. Most were taken as boys, castrated, and then trained. Their very bodies were reshaped by the demands of kingship. Some historians suggest they became symbols of loyalty and sacrifice, stripped of family ties so they could devote themselves entirely to the crown. Others argue this was less about loyalty and more about control. Break someone early enough and they're easier to bend. Historians still argue whether eunuchs were truly trusted partners in governance or simply victims of an oppressive system who carved out influence where they could. You step into a guardroom now, dimly lit, where a group of eunuchs sit cross-legged, sipping spiced tea. Their eyes flick toward you, and for a moment you feel the weight of being an outsider. These men aren't just guards, they're insiders of a world you can't fully understand. They know who the king favors this week, which wife is plotting to secure her son's inheritance, which courtier tried sneaking in a forbidden letter. Knowledge is power, and eunuchs had it in abundance. The more you watch them, the more you realize they were walking contradictions. On the one hand, they were mocked by some as incomplete men, pitied as victims of cruelty. On the other hand, they wielded influence that ordinary soldiers could only dream of. You picture a minister grumbling because a eunuch blocked his way, only to find out later that the same eunuch whispered in the Sultan's ear and changed the day's decision. That's not just a guard, that's a kingmaker in disguise. And here's another quirky tidbit that makes you snicker. In some courts, eunuchs were so associated with gossip that their very name became slang for rumour monger. Imagine if today, instead of saying, "Oh, that's office gossip," you said, "Oh, that's eunuch talk." HR would not know how to handle that memo. You follow one eunuch down a narrow hallway, his sandals slapping softly against the stone. He carries a set of keys that jingle like a haunting melody. Each key represents access to chambers, to secrets, to power. Without him, the harem is locked. With him, the whole system opens. And you can't shake the feeling that in some ways the harem belonged more to the eunuchs than to the king. After all, the king only dipped in occasionally. The eunuchs lived here, breathing the air of intrigue day and night. A mainstream example comes to mind. Kislar Aga, the chief black eunuch of the Ottoman harem, often held such power that foreign ambassadors sought his favour as much as the sultan's. He could promote or ruin careers with a nod, and because he had constant access to the women of the harem, he was the conduit for their influence too. If a queen wanted to send advice to the sultan, she slipped it through him. If a concubine wanted to maneuver her son into succession, she needed his cooperation. You chuckle, imagining him as a medieval version of a social media algorithm, deciding which sages get delivered and which just quietly vanish. Still, the role wasn't without danger. Eunuchs could fall just as quickly as they rose, lose the king's trust, and you could find yourself exiled, or worse. It makes you think about loyalty. Were they truly devoted to the king or just masters of survival? Historians debate this endlessly, pointing to some eunuchs who remained fiercely faithful and others who schemed behind the scenes. The truth is likely both. Power is intoxicating no matter how it's handed to you. You move deeper into the guard hall and you notice murals on the walls, not of kings, not of wives, but of geometric patterns. No personal glory for the eunuchs. Their identity was erased in official art, even as their whispers shaped the fate of empires. You think of it as the ultimate paradox, invisible men with visible power. As you sit on a low bench, you overhear one eunuch telling a joke to another. The punchline involves a king mistaking his 12th wife for his 20th because the torchlight was too dim. Both laugh quietly, the sound like muffled bells. You grin too. It's a reminder that even in these heavy corridors, humour found a way to survive. The eunuchs rise, straighten their robes, and return to their posts. They melt back into the architecture like shadows that never really leave. And as you follow the echo of their footsteps, you realize they weren't just guards. They were the nervous system of the harem, carrying signals between its heart and the throne. Without them, the system would collapse into chaos. With them, it hummed like a well-oiled, if occasionally gossip-ridden machine. And just before you leave, one eunuch glances at you with knowing eyes. It's a look that says he's seen everything, heard everything, and will remember everything. You shiver, realizing that in a world of locked doors, the man with the keys is always he most dangerous. You step past the watchful eunuchs, the jingle of their keys still echoing faintly in your ears, and now the air shifts. It's warmer here, thicker with perfume, chatter, and the faint clink of jewellery. You've entered the heart of the harem proper, where the wives themselves live and breathe, and where another invisible system rules, hierarchy. It isn't just about who's married to the king. It's about which wife you are, how close your chambers are to his, and how much sway your words carry when whispered into his ear. At first glance, it looks like a paradise of equals, dozens of women reclining on silk cushions playing board games, sipping sherbet drinks and listening to musicians. But you quickly notice the subtle signs. One woman's cushion is embroidered with gold, while another's is plain. One sits nearer the central fountain, her anklets jangling as she laughs too loudly, while others lean at the periphery, watching with polite envy. You've walked into a court within a court, where smiles are weapons and jewelry doubles as armor. Here's your mainstream fact. In the Ottoman harem, the hierarchy was formally structured, with the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, at the top, followed by the Haseki Sultan, chief consort, then the Kadins, wives of lesser rank, and finally the concubines. The system was so strict that even the distance of a woman's chambers from the Sultan's rooms physically reflected her status. You picture it like a medieval office plan: corner suite for the CEO's favourite, cubicles for the middle managers, and a windowless back room for the interns. The quirky tidbit comes to you as you overhear giggling near a side room. A group of younger concubines are whispering about the pearl spoon test. Supposedly, some kings use spoons carved from pearls for their favourite wives, while the rest got plain wood. Imagine dinner service where the cutlery itself announced your rank. "Oh, you're eating with wood tonight. Yikes, better luck next banquet." You chuckle to yourself, realizing it's the medieval version of checking who gets the blue checkmark on social media. The hierarchy isn't just about material perks, it's about access. The top-ranked wives and the king's mother can visit him freely, while the lower ranks wait for summons like anxious students hoping the teacher calls on them. You imagine the stress, rehearsing jokes, memorizing poetry, even practicing the art of walking gracefully, all in hopes of being noticed. If it sounds like a reality show, that's because it kind of was. You half expect a dramatic voiceover. This week on the Sultan's Favourites, only one consort gets upgraded to a golden cushion. But don't be fooled into thinking the competition was all giggles. Behind the playful chatter lurked serious stakes. Wives weren't just competing for attention, they were competing for the future of their children. If your son became the heir, your influence skyrocketed. If not, you risked fading into irrelevance. You picture the stakes like a board game of Risk, except the armies are made of lullabies, bedtime stories, and carefully timed smiles. Historians still argue how cutthroat this competition really was. Some sources describe harems as hotbeds of jealousy, with wives scheming, poisoning, or even hiring assassins to eliminate rivals. Others caution that such tales were exaggerated by outsiders, foreign travellers who loved spicing up their stories for shocked audiences back home. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Rivalry existed, but it might not have been the blood-soaked soap opera some chroniclers claimed. Still, as you watch two women exchange polite but icy compliments near the fountain, you think, yep, this is definitely more than small talk. You move deeper into the chamber and notice a throne-like chair raised slightly higher than the others. Sitting there is an older woman, regal in demeanor, her every gesture radiating authority. This must be the Valide Sultan, or in other cultures, the Queen Mother. Her position reminds you that while wives competed for the king's favor, his mother often ruled the harem like a general. In fact, during certain Ottoman reigns, the Queen Mother wielded more political power than the wives combined. Imagine your mother-in-law not just judging your cooking, but also deciding the fate of the empire. You mutter, "Yeah, I'd lose that argument too." Nearby, a younger wife shows off an embroidered shawl clearly meant to impress. Another subtly rolls her eyes. You catch the exchange and realize this wasn't just about romance, it was theater. together. Every gesture, every piece of jewelry, every laugh at the right moment was part of a silent competition for rank, and with dozens of women vying for favor, it's no wonder hierarchies formed. Without them, the palace might have turned into a free-for-all. Here's another quirky image. In Mughal India, some wives reportedly had their own mini-palaces within the larger harem, each with its own kitchen and servants. So while one wife might host poetry nights, another might host chess tournaments, and another might tempt the king with experimental desserts, you imagine the king strolling through like a medieval food critic. Great chess game, love the biryani, but the poetry could use work. If nothing else, his evenings were never boring. Still, the hierarchy could be brutal. If a wife lost favour, she could be demoted to near invisibility. Her jewels taken, her chamber reassigned, her voice silenced. You feel a pang of sympathy for the women at the edges of the room, their laughter a little too forced, their smiles a little too practiced. He still dressed in luxury, yes, but the weight of irrelevance hung on their shoulders like invisible chains. Historians still argue whether the wives at the bottom had any real agency at all. Some suggest they lived out their days in comfortable obscurity, essentially pampered prisoners. Others argue they found ways to influence through networks, befriending servants, whispering to eunuchs, or even mentoring younger wives who might one day rise in rank. The debate continues, but as you watch one woman slip a note discreetly to a eunuch, you suspect influence had many secret pathways. The sound of music swells as a small troop of entertainers enters the chamber. The wives clap along, their eyes flicking constantly toward the throne where the king might appear. Even in joy, there's tension, like a constant audition. You realize hierarchy wasn't just enforced by rules, it was etched into the daily rhythm of life. Where you sat, what you wore, who you spoke to, it all signaled your rank in this elaborate human pyramid. You settle into a corner cushion, trying to blend in. The air is sweet with rosewater, heavy with ambition, and humming with rivalry. And as you watch queens, consorts, and concubines play their roles in this silent theatre of status, you can't help but think this wasn't just a harem, it was an empire within an empire, run on hierarchy as carefully engineered as the palace walls themselves. As you continue down the corridor, you pass an alcove where two women whisper, their heads bent close. One is a princess recently arrived, her accent still foreign. She's explaining to the other how her father negotiated land rights as part of her marriage. The other nods sympathetically, offering advice on how to smile at the right time, how to wear her veil to impress, how to slip messages back to her homeland. You step softly past, realizing you've stumbled on a lesson. Being married off didn't mean the politics stopped. These women were still chess pieces, but some of them were learning how to move themselves across the board. Another mainstream example flashes in your mind. In medieval Europe, royal daughters were traded in much the same way. Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriages reshaped half of Europe's political map, and her children went on to rule kingdoms. Different culture, same principle. Daughters were dynastic glue, even if the glue sometimes cracked under pressure. You mutter, it's basically Game of Thrones, except with fewer dragons and way more dowries. The quirky tidbit grows darker when you recall that some families went so far as to send multiple daughters into the same harem, doubling their chances of influence. Imagine being shipped off with your sister, then competing for the same king's favour. Thanksgiving dinners back home must have been awkward. Pass the bread, and also sorry for trying to outshine you in poetry recitals last week. The weight of it presses on you as you step into another courtyard. This one is quieter, filled with fragrant orange trees and benches. You sit down, the stone cool beneath you, and let the thought sink in. To kings, these daughters were threads in a political web. To their families, they were investments. To themselves, Well, that's harder to say. Did they feel like envoys, prisoners, survivors? Historians still debate, but you can almost hear the silent chorus of portraits staring from the gallery. We were all of these things, and more. Nearby, children chase each other, their laughter rising above the fountain's splash. Some are sons of these politically traded brides. Their fates are even heavier, to be heirs, pawns, or sacrifices in the next generation's succession game. The cycle never ended. You shake your head, realizing that the palace was less a home than a political machine, grinding endlessly through human lives to keep the gears of empire turning. And yet, within that machinery, you sense resilience. Some daughters rose to astonishing heights, queen consorts who bent kings to their will, mothers who secured thrones for their sons, cultural patrons who turned harems into centers of art and learning. Their families may have sent them as pawns, but they learned to play queens. You glance up at the portraits again and swear one of the painted eyes winks knowingly at you. You stand, brushing dust from your robe, and head back toward the harem's inner chambers. The sound of music drifts again, layered now with whispers, bargains, and secret promises. And you realize that while kings claimed to rule with armies and treasures, much of their power actually came wrapped in veils and carried in the steps of daughters who walked unwillingly into torchlit palaces. You follow the winding halls deeper into the palace, and soon the murmurs of wives and eunuchs fade into another sound altogether. Drums. Slow, deliberate, ceremonial beats echo from a vaulted chamber ahead. You creep closer, and suddenly the air thickens with rosewater and steam. You've stumbled into one of the strangest, most theatrical parts of royal life, the rituals of entry. This is how new brides and concubines were introduced into the harem. It wasn't simply a matter of, here's your new room, enjoy the fountain view. No, there were entire ceremonies, step by step, designed to purify, impress, and test the new arrival before she could even dream of reaching the king. The first ritual is the bath. You find yourself in a marble hammam, its domed ceiling pierced with star-shaped holes that let in slivers of light. The steam wraps around you like a ghostly shawl. In the center, young women sit nervously as attendants scrub their skin with perfumed oils and exotic pastes. It looks luxurious, but you know this isn't just pampering, it's purification. In many cultures, including the Ottomans, ritual bathing symbolized cleansing from one life and entering another. One mainstream fact clicks here. Topkapi Palace in Istanbul had elaborate bathhouses built specifically for the harem, where new entrants were bathed and perfumed as part of their initiation. Imagine being told your marriage contract comes with mandatory spa treatments. Sounds nice, until you remember the spa is also a gate into a gilded cage. You watch as attendants rub saffron paste onto one bride's skin to make it glow golden under torchlight. Another is anointed with rose oil until she smells like an entire garden. The room shimmers with steam, and you almost feel drowsy from the heady scents. But then comes the quirky tidbit. In Mughal India, some brides were reportedly bathed in milk and honey. Picture Saul, that literally sitting in a giant tub of dessert. You mutter under your breath, so basically, medieval royalty invented the first luxury milkshake bath. You can't help but laugh, though the bride in the tub doesn't look amused. After bathing comes the dressing. Attendants drape silks around the new arrival, layer after layer, until she's swaddled in fabrics worth more than some village's yearly taxes. Jewels are pinned in her hair, anklets clasped at her feet, bracelets stacked up her arms. You think it looks beautiful, yes, but also heavy, like she's being wrapped not just in cloth, but in expectation. Each gem, each thread, each clink of metal says, you now belong to the king. The next step is the test of etiquette. Older wives and senior attendants watch as the new bride bows, walks, speaks, even drinks from a cup. Every gesture is noted. Too clumsy, she risks ridicule. Too confident, she risks suspicion. It feels like a talent show where the prize isn't money but survival. You imagine a row of stern judges, Simon Cowell style, whispering to each other. Her bow was sloppy, but I like her hand gestures. 7 out of 10. Historians still argue just how rigid these entry rituals were. Some records describe them in painstaking detail. Every bath, every perfume, every bow meticulously rehearsed. Others suggest the rituals may have been exaggerated by chroniclers or foreign visitors who wanted to dazzle audiences with exotic stories. Was every single concubine bathed in milk? Probably not. But was ceremony a central part of entry? Undoubtedly. Scholars continue to debate whether these rituals were sincere spiritual traditions or simply staged performances to dramatize the king's power. Historians still argue about the true function of this opulence. Some claim it was designed to keep wives content, distracting them from rivalries or loneliness. Others argue it was meant more as propaganda, ensuring visitors and courtiers saw the king's household as impossibly luxurious, proof of divine favour. Was the wealth truly for the wives, or were they simply part of the stage set in a theatre of abundance? The debate lingers, much like the smell of roasted lamb clinging to your robe. You pass into another chamber where fountains gurgle, each one tipped with silver spouts shaped like lions and peacocks. Pools shimmer with floating petals, and attendants sprinkle perfume into the water so the air itself smells expensive. You mutter, "Yep, even their plumbing is fancier than my entire apartment." And you realize this too was wealth. Water redirected from aqueducts just so wives could dip their toes into perfumed fountains. It wasn't practical, but it was mesmerizing. The quirky detail that makes you grin comes when you hear a story from a passing eunuch. Apparently, in some courts, wives were given jeweled slippers with tiny bells so that when they walked, the king could hear them coming. Imagine turning your hallway into a permanent wind chime concert. You chuckle, thinking, sure, it's charming, until you're trying to sneak into the kitchen at midnight for leftover pastries. As the banquet winds down, you notice how servants scurry to refill cups, replace plates, straighten cushions. The scale of labor is staggering. To maintain this fountain of wealth, armies of workers lived in the shadows, their names forgotten. For every wife dripping in pearls, there were dozens of seamstresses stitching late into the night. For every plate of honeyed lamb, there were farmers, cooks, and porters who never tasted a bite. You sigh, realizing that the harem's beauty rested at an invisible backs. Historians still debate whether the wives appreciated this wealth or resented it. Some sources describe them reveling in jewels, cosmetics, and fine food, competing to outshine each other. Others suggest that luxury became meaningless over time, turning into gilded monotony. After all, how exciting is your 50th tray of candied apricots when you haven't seen the outside world in years? You glance at a jeweled cup and think, yep, it's gorgeous, but water's still just water. You step outside into another courtyard where the wives stroll, silks rustling, jewels flashing. They look like moving treasuries, each one a walking advertisement of the king's wealth. And maybe that was the point. The king didn't need to tell visitors he was powerful. His wives did it for him just by existing, glittering like constellations in the lamplight. Still comma beneath the glamour. You sense the irony. Wealth this vast wasn't always sustainable. Empires strained under the cost of feeding, clothing, and entertaining entire harems. Historians note that some treasuries emptied not from war but from domestic extravagance. You can't help but joke softly, so the empire didn't collapse because of invaders. It collapsed because the jewelry budget went overboard. As you leave the banquet hall, the echoes of music and laughter fade, but the image lingers. Wives adorned like treasures, fountains bubbling perfume, feasts piled higher than logic demands. You realize that wealth here wasn't just enjoyed, it was weaponized, transformed into a spectacle to dazzle, control, and distract. And as the torches flicker against jeweled walls, you can't shake the thought that the palace itself was one giant stage, and wealth was the spotlight. You step away from the dazzling banquets and jeweled fountains, your stomach still reeling from the smell of roasted lamb and your eyes dazzled by pearls. Now you find yourself in quieter corridors where the noise of music fades and another rhythm takes over, the rhythm of daily life. The wives and concubines, despite their silks and jewels, lived lives filled not only with ceremony but also with routine. You drift into their quarters and suddenly you're surrounded not by gold platters or diamond-studded thrones, but by the hum of ordinary activities. Ordinary at least for women trapped inside palaces. You pass into a chamber where several women sit cross-legged on cushions, brushes in hand, painting delicate patterns onto parchment. The smell of ink and ground pigments mingles with the faint perfume of roses. They chatter as they work, their voices light, their laughter quick. One leans over her work and whispers, "If he doesn't like my poem tonight, I'll just blame the ink for smudging." Another giggles, painting a flower that suspiciously resembles the Queen Mother's nose. You stifle a laugh, realizing that even here, art doubles as subtle rebellion. Here's your mainstream fact. The Ottoman harem at Topkapi Palace wasn't just a place for wives to sit idly. It was also a place of education where women were taught poetry, music, embroidery, and sometimes politics. Many consorts became patrons of the arts, commissioning poetry, architecture, and calligraphy. In some cases, their influence extended beyond the harem walls, shaping the cultural identity of empires. You glance at one woman bent over a calligraphy scroll and think, so while kings swung swords, these women were literally writing history. The room hums with activity. Some women embroider elaborate tapestries, their needles flicking in and out like the wings of busy bees. Others gather around a chessboard, whispering strategies as though their lives depend on the outcome. In a way, maybe they do. One wife mutters, "Checkmate," and her rival forces a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. You realize that games here were more than games. They were metaphors for survival. The quirky tidbit arrives when you wander into another chamber and find women playing with what looks like a board game involving dice and carved elephants. A eunuch nearby explains that some harems invented their own games to pass the time, mixing gambling with gossip. You can't help but imagine them whispering wagers like, "Loser has to wear the ugly green veil to dinner." Suddenly the harem feels less like a prison and more like a boarding school with too much jewelry. Still, boredom was a constant enemy. Daily life wasn't endless excitement, it was endless waiting. Waiting for the king's summons, waiting for news from home, waiting for a chance to rise in rank. You walk past a window where one woman stares at the courtyard, her gaze far away. She sighs, the sound heavy, and you realize that beneath the laughter and gossip, loneliness stalked these halls like a shadow. Historians still argue about how much autonomy women really had in daily life. Some accounts suggest they were endlessly supervised, their every movement noted. Others describe harems as surprisingly free inside their walls, with women forming close-knit communities, hosting salons, and even influencing politics through networks of friendship. The debate continues, but as you watch a group of women leaning close, whispering furiously while pretending to sew, you think, yep, this is definitely more than embroidery. You step into another chamber where music fills the air. A young concubine plucks at a lute, her voice soft, while others clap in rhythm. It feels cozy, almost like a living room concert. You can imagine nights spent here with stories, songs, and laughter, moments of joy carved out of confinement. You chuckle softly, whispering, medieval Netflix binges, but live and acoustic. As the day unfolds, you notice the routines. Morning baths scented with oils, afternoons of sewing, painting, or lessons, evenings of music, feasts, or waiting to see if the king will call. The monotony is broken only by gossip. One woman leans over to another and whispers, "Did you hear? She tripped during the procession yesterday, nearly landed in the fountain." The other gasps, eyes wide, and both dissolve into laughter. You shake your head, amused, because some things never change. Whether in a medieval harem or a modern office, gossip is eternal. Here's another quirky tidbit. Some harems had trained parrots that mimicked the wives' gossip. Imagine saying something scandalous only for a bird to squawk it across the courtyard. The king snores. You grin, thinking, that's less a pet, more a feathered snitch. The afternoon sun slants through lattice windows, scattering patterns across the marble floor. Children's laughter echoes from a side room, princes and princesses playing tag under the watchful eyes of tutors and mothers. You notice how carefully they're tended, as if each child is a precious coin in the kingdom's treasury. After all, they might one day be heirs or pawns or both. Daily life for the women included endless worry for their children's futures. Even as they smiled and played in the courtyard, historians still debate whether the harem was primarily a prison or a community. Was daily life stifling, filled with jealousy and boredom, or was it a sanctuary where women created vibrant mini-worlds of art, learning and friendship? The answer probably lies in the middle. You sense both truths here, one woman laughing with friends, another staring out the window in silence. Joy and sorrow mingled daily, like perfumes in the air. You sit near a fountain where a group of women trade recipes, arguing about the best way to sweeten sherbet. One insists on honey, another on sugar, and soon they're giggling like teenagers. You smile, realizing that even queens argued about desserts. You mutter, somewhere a modern chef just fainted, knowing medieval harems debated the same thing. Evening falls and the harem comes alive again. Lamps are lit, musicians return, and dinner trays are carried in. The wives gather in clusters, some chatting, some sulking, some rehearsing songs or poetry in case the king calls. It's equal parts slumber party and audition, a surreal mix of coziness and tension. You can almost hear a host announcing, tonight's winner gets an upgrade to a golden cushion. The losers, better luck tomorrow. As you prepare to leave the chamber, you glance back at the women laughing, painting, gossiping, plotting. Their lives are strange hybrids, part luxury, part prison, part sisterhood, part rivalry. And in their daily routines, you see the humanity behind the politics, the small joys, the whispered schemes, the boredom, the bursts of laughter that cut through marble walls. You leave behind the gossip-filled lounge where women argued over sherbet recipes and stroll into a quieter wing of the harem. The air here feels different, less perfumed, more charged with thought. Instead of laughter and music, you hear the soft scratch of quills, the murmur of recited verses, the shuffle of parchment. You realize you've stumbled into one of the best-kept secrets of the harem. The classrooms dot behind carved wooden screens. A handful of women sit with straight backs, their eyes fixed on tutors who whisper lessons in low voices. You pause, peeking through a lattice, and your heart catches. You expected idleness, embroidery, maybe endless gossip, but here you see women being schooled in poetry, philosophy, and even politics. The harem, for all its glitter and restrictions, was also a university in disguise. A tutor unrolls a scroll of Persian verse, reading aloud the poetry of Rumi. The women repeat the lines softly, their voices weaving together like threads of silk. The sound is gentle, almost hypnotic, and you think to yourself, well, at least they got better bedtime stories than I did in school. Here's your mainstream fact. The Ottoman imperial harem educated its women extensively in music, literature, languages, and court etiquette. Some women even learned statecraft, preparing to influence politics through their sons or directly through the sultan. This was no idle pastime. The lessons turned them into advisors, diplomats, and patrons of the arts. You imagine one of these women stepping out of the classroom and whispering political advice into the king's ear while he's still chewing on a piece of baklava. That's power disguised as pillow talk. You creep further along the corridor and notice another room, this one filled with instruments, lutes, drums, flutes, even a primitive organ. A group of women rehearse, their fingers plucking strings while tutors clap the rhythm. It's mesmerizing, but you can't help but grin. One lute is slightly out of tune, and the tutor's face crumples in frustration. You whisper, even royal harems couldn't escape the curse of the kid who forgot to practice. But then you catch something stranger, something whispered with a hint of danger. In the back corner, hidden behind a screen, a tutor draws shapes in chalk on a slate. Circles, stars, arcs, astronomy. You lean closer, your breath catching. This isn't just stargazing for fun, it's mapping the heavens, predicting eclipses, discussing planetary movement. In many medieval cultures, astronomy bordered dangerously close to astrology, sometimes even heresy. Teaching it to royal wives, that's practically revolutionary. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Mughal sources suggest that women in the harem studied not only poetry but also mathematics and astronomy, sometimes using astrolabes to chart the stars. Imagine sneaking past guards to hide under a curtain with your girlfriends and saying, "Okay, but what if Venus really is in retrograde?" You chuckle softly, realizing that medieval harems might have been the birthplace of astrology memes long before Instagram. Historians still argue whether these lessons were widespread or limited to a few privileged women. Some claim that most wives received only basic training in etiquette and the arts, while a select elite were groomed for political influence. Others argue that many women were surprisingly well-educated, their talents deliberately hidden from public view. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere between the quill and the gossip bench. Still, the whispers you hear behind these screens make it clear education thrived even if it had to do so in secret. You sit cross-legged by the doorway, watching as one woman recites poetry with perfect rhythm. Another debates with her tutor over the meaning of a verse, her tone sharp, her wit sharper. You can almost hear her future, negotiating alliances, advising her son when he becomes king, or quietly reshaping the empire from behind a curtain. Education here wasn't just knowledge, it was ammunition. And it wasn't always tame. One tutor, older and bold, leans close to his students and tells them about faraway lands, China, Persia, Europe. He describes their customs, their rulers, their armies. You realize he's not just teaching literature, he's teaching geopolitics. The wives listen intently, their eyes gleaming with curiosity. You mutter to yourself, "Great, so now they know more about world politics than most of us do after 3 cups of coffee and a doom scroll." The lessons shift again. A servant brings in paints, and the women begin sketching delicate miniatures of flowers, birds, and gardens. It looks like innocent art practice, but you realize these images might carry coded meanings. A rose for love, a nightingale for longing, a locked cage for their own situation. Education was not only about learning, it was also about expression, finding ways to speak when words were forbidden. You lean against the cool marble wall, marveling at the resilience on display. These women, confined by walls, used education to stretch their minds beyond them. They memorized poetry so they could recite it like armor. They learned music so they could soothe or influence. They studied astronomy to understand a universe larger than their gilded prison. You whisper, "Okay, they definitely had better after-school programs than I did." Another quirky moment comes when a tutor demonstrates arithmetic using gemstones as counters. You watch as emeralds and rubies are shuffled into piles to demonstrate. The addition and subtraction, you grin, thinking, math class but with bling. No wonder they paid attention. But the stakes of this education were never trivial. A well-educated wife could become a powerful political player. A poorly educated one might fade into irrelevance. Historians still debate whether kings encouraged this learning as a way to cultivate loyal, intelligent companions or tolerated it reluctantly, fearing the influence it gave women. Some rulers openly praised their educated consorts, others tried to suppress their ambitions. The arguments continue, much like the hushed voices drifting from these classrooms. You stretch your legs and wander to another corner, where a small group of women huddle over a parchment, whispering as they copy a text. You lean closer and see that it's a translation of a Greek philosophical work. Your eyebrows rise. Plato in the harem? That's not embroidery, that's revolution. You mutter under your breath, if Plato knew his words were being copied here, he'd probably write another dialogue just to brag about it. As night falls, the lessons wind down. Scrolls are rolled, instruments put away, screens drawn closed. The women disperse, some heading to their chambers, others lingering to whisper and laugh. But the energy in the air is unmistakable. This was not idle pastime. This was empowerment in whispers, resistance through learning, survival through knowledge. You step back into the corridor, your mind buzzing as much as theirs must have been. The palace may have locked their bodies behind walls, but through poetry, politics, and forbidden astronomy, their minds soared far beyond marble and torchlight. You leave the hushed classrooms behind, still hearing the echo of poetry and the scratch of quills, and drift into a darker wing of the harem. The air here feels different, heavier, thicker, charged with something you can't quite name. It isn't perfume or incense, it's intrigue. You can practically hear it in the way conversations lower when you approach, how women tilt their heads just a little too close, how laughter ends too suddenly when a eunuch steps by. This is the realm of whispers, the place where rebellion doesn't march with banners but hides in gossip, glances, and cleverly folded notes. You settle into a shadowy corner, and immediately your ears pick up the currents. Two women are hunched over a game board, their voices casual, but you notice how their fingers tap in coded rhythms. One says something innocuous about the weather, and the other nods with a gleam in her eye that says the conversation isn't about rain at all. You lean closer, realizing that rebellion here doesn't look like swords and shields. It looks like subtlety. Here's your mainstream fact. The Ottoman harem wasn't just a domestic space, it was a political one. Women of the harem, especially the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and powerful consorts often influenced imperial decisions, controlled patronage, and sometimes even dictated succession. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this influence became so significant that historians call the era the Sultanate of Women. Imagine that. Whole decades of empire shaped not by men on thrones but by women behind screens, armed with whispers sharper than daggers. The quirky tidbit makes you grin despite the tension. In some harems, women used embroidery as a secret code. Flowers, colours and stitches carried hidden messages. A tulip might mean loyalty, a broken vine might signal betrayal. Imagine slipping someone a pillow cover that doubles as photos. Liturgical instructions. You chuckle to yourself, whispering, basically medieval WhatsApp, but with better sewing skills. You look around and see how rebellion seeps into daily life. A wife persuades a eunuch to delay delivering a letter, changing the timing of a political decision. Another bribes a servant to carry gossip to a courtier, knowing the rumor will ripple through the palace like wildfire. A third quietly sends gifts, spices, coins, fabrics, to allies outside, weaving her own network of influence. The rebellion isn't loud, it's invisible, but you can feel it humming in the walls. Historians still argue about how much of this rebellion was intentional manipulation versus accidental influence. Were the wives truly plotting, or were they simply surviving within a system that happened to magnify their choices? Some sources paint them as master schemers, Machiavellis in silk slippers. Others caution that travellers and chroniclers loved exaggerating their power, turning minor intrigues into grand conspiracies. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Some wives plotted, others just whispered. But in a palace this sensitive, even a whisper could shake thrones. You lean closer as a conversation drifts your way. Two wives are discussing the king's latest decision about a tax reform. One sighs, saying he only listened to that minister because she told him to. The other scoffs. Well, then maybe it's time we tell him something different. You shiver, realizing you're hearing politics not in council halls but in bedrooms. And sometimes rebellion wasn't just about policy, it was about survival. If a wife's son was threatened by rivals, she had to act fast, weaving alliances inside and outside the harem to secure his place. You picture mothers plotting late at night, whispering strategies like chess masters, knowing their children's lives depended on every move. You mutter under your breath, "Suddenly, my family's arguments over board games don't seem so high stakes." Another quirky tidbit surfaces when you overhear a eunuch chuckling about how one consort convinced the king to cancel an execution simply by distracting him with a new dessert recipe. You grin, thinking, talk about baking for justice, move over Great British Bake Off. But beneath the humour the truth glimmers. Rebellion didn't always look like daggers, it sometimes looked like cinnamon sprinkled in the right place at the right time. The walls themselves seemed to lean in as you realise the harem was a political storm hidden in velvet curtains. Outsiders might have dismissed it as gossip and luxury, but you now see it differently. Each rumour carried weight, each gesture rippled outward, each whisper could shift the balance of power. Historians still debate whether this influence weakened empires. Some argue that too much palace intrigue distracted rulers from real governance. Others claim it strengthened states by ensuring decisions were filtered through multiple layers of council. Either way, the whispers mattered. You can't run a kingdom without listening to the people closest to you, even if those people are wives sipping sherbet in silken chambers. You step into another courtyard where a small group of women sit under an orange tree. Their voices are low, their hands busy with embroidery, but their words dart like arrows. They're discussing which courtier might be bribed, which province might rebel, which rival wife is falling out of favour. To an outsider, it looks like idle chatter. To you, it sounds like a strategy session. You think, honestly, I'd rather trust their predictions than half the royal astrologers. As night falls, the whispers only grow stronger. Shadows lengthen, lamps flicker, and the air hums with secrets. One wife slips a note to a eunuch, another slips a coin into a servant's hand, another slips a story into the ear of a musician who will sing it disguised as a ballad. Rebellion here isn't just whispered, it's sung, stitched, and staged. You whisper to yourself, if Shakespeare had peeked into a harem, he'd have had enough material for 10 tragedies. You finally step back, your head spinning. These women may not have marched with armies, but their whispers shaped the destinies of kings. And as the night closes in, you realize rebellion doesn't always roar. Sometimes it murmurs, sometimes it hums. Sometimes it's just a single word, spoken in the right ear at the right moment, that changes the course of history. The whispers of rebellion still hum in your ears as you wander into yet another courtyard. This one is different, no jeweled banquets or embroidered poetry here. Instead, the air is pierced with shrieks of laughter and the patter of small feet. Children dart between orange trees and marble benches, their bright robes fluttering like little flags. For a moment, it almost feels normal, like you've stumbled into an oversized daycare. But then you notice the shadows that follow them. Watchful mothers, stern eunuchs, cautious tutors. These children aren't just children, they're living chess pieces, every move monitored, every laugh loaded with political weight. You sit by a fountain and watch a group of boys kick a leather ball. One misses a kick and pouts dramatically, while the others cheer. It looks harmless, until you remember that each one of these boys is a potential heir to the throne. Their fates are already entangled in succession struggles, long before they can even spell the word succession. You mutter, "Imagine your family game of soccer deciding the fate of an empire. No pressure, kid." Here's your mainstream fact. In the Ottoman Empire, princes were often raised within the harem until they were old enough to govern provinces, a system known as the sanjak assignments. But not all sons got that chance. Succession wasn't peaceful or guaranteed. Brothers frequently fought, sometimes fatally, for the throne. Mothers in the harem knew that securing their son's position was a matter of life and death, literally. You glance at one boy climbing a fig tree and wonder if his mother is silently calculating alliances, even as he giggles in the branches. Nearby, a group of princesses sit with tutors, reciting verses and learning to play the lute. Their lives, too, are destined for politics. They aren't heirs, but they are valuable pawns in the marriage game. One day, it'll be sent off to cement alliances, their childhood games replaced by banquet halls in distant lands. You sigh, realizing that for these girls, hopscotch was just a rehearsal for geopolitics. The quirky tidbit makes you grin despite the tension. Some records suggest royal children were sometimes gifted exotic pets, monkeys, cheetahs, even elephants, to show off their status. Imagine being 8 years old and telling your tutor, "Sorry, I can't do math right now, my pet cheetah is hungry." You shake your head thinking, honestly, that's the kind of homework excuse I wish I'd had. But the darker truth seeps in as you notice how carefully the children are separated. One cluster of boys plays under the watch of a specific group of eunuchs. Another cluster is kept apart, their mothers glaring at each other across the courtyard. You realize this isn't playtime, it's politics in miniature. Each mother is ensuring her son isn't outshined, injured, or worse. Every scraped knee, every lost game, every spilled cup of sherbet could be twisted into a narrative about weakness. Historians still argue about how much agency these children really had. Were they truly pawns, helpless in the games of their mothers and the court? Or did some boys learn early to manipulate their environment, forming alliances of their own even in childhood? There are tales of princes showing cunning before their voices even broke, but it's hard to know if those stories are history or legend. What's certain is that their lives were never their own. You shift your gaze to one boy being tutored in swordplay. His tutor corrects his grip, showing him how to hold the blade steady. The boy frowns, sweat beading on his forehead, his small arms straining. You realize that this practice isn't about discipline, it's about preparation. That sword isn't just a toy. One day it might be the difference between his survival and his brother's victory. You whisper under your breath, sibling rivalry, now with actual swords. On the far side of the courtyard, mothers hover like hawks. One whispers urgently to a eunuch, pointing at her son. Another adjusts her child's robe, making sure he looks regal even while chasing a ball. You sense the constant calculations. If he befriends that boy, will it help us? If she learns that song, will it impress the king? The children may not understand the stakes yet, but their mothers certainly do. The quirky detail resurfaces when you overhear a servant talking about how some mothers tried to give their sons lucky foods, special herbs or desserts believed to bring favor or strength. Imagine sneaking saffron-sprinkled pastries into your son's lunchbox, convinced it'll make him heir. You grin, whispering, "Forget Wheaties, this is the real breakfast of champions." As dusk settles, the children are gathered for evening lessons. They sit cross-legged in neat rows, their tutors teaching them languages, history and religion. One recites a verse from memory, his voice clear. Another stumbles and blushes as his peers giggle. It looks innocent enough, but you know each lesson is sharpening their minds for future battles, not just on fields, but in council chambers. You think, so basically every pop quiz here doubles as a throne rehearsal. Historians still debate whether mothers manipulated their sons more for personal ambition or genuine survival. Some scholars argue mothers were ruthless, willing, to sacrifice rivals to secure power. Others suggest they were simply protecting their children in a brutal system that forced them to choose between plotting or perishing. Watching a mother embrace her son tightly before sending him off to his tutor, you feel the truth lies in both, love and ambition tangled so tightly you can't separate them. Night falls, and the children are led back to their chambers. Their laughter fades into silence, replaced by the flicker of lamps and the low hum of mothers whispering strategies behind closed doors. You stand alone in the courtyard, the orange trees heavy with fruit, and realize the game never stopped. For these children, even play was politics. And as you turn to leave, you think about the strange irony. Empires rose and fell not just on battlefields, but in courtyards where children chased balls and giggled over pets. Pawns on the board, yes, but pawns with the power to topple kings if moved carefully enough. The courtyard of laughing children fades behind you as the night grows heavier. You walk through another set of doors and suddenly the atmosphere shifts. The playfulness of childhood gives way to the sharp edge of rivalry. Here, the laughter is gone, replaced by tense whispers, rattling swords, and the faint scrape of steel being sharpened against stone. You've stumbled into the heart of royal danger. Succession. Every giggling prince you saw earlier will one day face the cold reality that only one of them can inherit the throne. And in kingdoms where kings collected wives like trophies, there were often dozens of princes. Each mother believed her son should be the chosen one, and each son, encouraged since childhood, believed it too. The result? Succession wasn't smooth, it was chaos in silk robes. You creep into a hall where young men, no longer children but not yet rulers, sit in circles with their supporters. One sharp-eyed youth leans close to a eunuch, whispering promises of wealth if he delivers the right letter to the right courtier. Another boy, taller, struts like he already wears the crown, though he still has ink stains on his fingers from lessons. Their mothers hover nearby, their veils hiding smirks and calculations. You think to yourself, sibling rivalry is bad enough when it's about who gets the last cookie. Add thrones and armies to the mix and you've got yourself a bloodbath. Here's your mainstream fact. In the Ottoman Empire, succession was infamous for fratricide. When a new sultan ascended the throne, it was common practice for him to execute his brothers to secure power. Mehmed III, for example, reportedly had 19 of his brothers strangled in one night to prevent civil war. You shiver at the thought, whispering, "So much for sibling sleepovers." But before daggers are drawn, the battles begin with whispers. You overhear one prince's supporter spreading rumors. His brother stutters when nervous. Can such a man lead armies? Another whispers, that boy is too fond of wine, he'll ruin the empire. You realize that succession struggles were as much about image as they were about swords. A single rumor could kill a reputation before a single blade was unsheathed. The quirky tidbit surfaces in the form of bedtime rituals. Some records claim rival brothers would try to outdo each other by hiring poets or musicians to serenade the king at night, hoping to impress him with talent or wit. Imagine trying to fall asleep while your sons compete with lute solos outside your door. You chuckle softly, whispering, "Forget lullabies. This is medieval America's Got Talent." Still, beneath the comedy, the danger is real. You step into another chamber where two brothers glare at each other across a chessboard. Their moves are sharp, aggressive, every captured pawn slammed with unnecessary force. To anyone else it looks like a game. To you it feels like rehearsal for war. You mutter when chess turns into a preview of tomorrow's stabbing. Historians still argue whether succession chaos truly weakened empires or paradoxically kept them strong. Some claim the brutal culling of rivals prevented civil wars, ensuring one decisive heir. Others argue it drained empires of talent, killing off capable princes who might have ruled well. The debate continues, but standing here, hearing the scratch of blades in the dark, you suspect both are true. Stability came at the cost of blood, and sometimes that blood ran thicker than rivers. You notice how mothers played key roles in this chaos. One slips a jewel-encrusted dagger to her son, whispering fiercely in his ear. Another bribes a guard to accidentally leave a door unlocked, yet another secretly poisons her son's rival with a honeyed cake. You realize the real wars weren't fought as tea in fields. They were fought in bedrooms, kitchens and courtyards, every bite of food and every whispered lullaby carrying potential danger. Here's another quirky detail. Some harems reportedly kept astrologers on hand specifically to chart which prince's stars looked most favorable. Imagine sitting down to breakfast only to be told, "Sorry, Mercury isn't in your favor, so you're probably not destined to rule." You snort, whispering, "Talk about getting rejected by the zodiac." The tension rises as you follow one particular prince into a narrow hallway. He stops to adjust his robe, his hand lingering on the dagger at his waist. His eyes dart nervously, scanning the shadows. You realize that for him, bedtime isn't about rest. It's about survival. Will his brother strike tonight? Will his food be safe? Will the guards change sides by morning? You whisper, "Forget sleep hygiene tips. This kid needs a moat around his bed." Historians still debate whether these princes truly lived in constant fear or whether the tales of paranoia are exaggerated. Some suggest rivalries were fierce but controlled, with mothers mediating until the king died. Others argue the harem was a pressure cooker where every glance could turn lethal. Watching the prince's trembling hand on his dagger, you lean toward the latter. The hall grows colder as you imagine the inevitable climax. One son crowned, the others silenced. The eunuchs would carry out the grim tasks, the mothers weeping or plotting anew, and the cycle would repeat. Succession chaos wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of a system where kings hoarded wives and multiplied heirs. You whisper, "When you've got 100 wives, you're not just making family, you're making civil war in advance." In another chamber, a group of mothers sit together, their eyes red-rimmed but determined. They trade stories, warnings, advice, how to protect a son, how to maneuver alliances, how to survive if he fails. You realize the harem wasn't just a place of rivalry, it was also a place of grief, where women watched their children become pawns and sometimes corpses in the Game of Thrones. As you step back into the corridor, the air feels heavier, the silence sharper. You can almost hear daggers sliding from sheaths, whispers turning into shouts, footsteps running in the night. Succession wasn't smooth or ceremonial. It was chaos dressed in velvet, betrayal sung as lullabies, brother against brother, until only one crown remained. And as the lamps flicker low, you sigh, realizing the cruel truth. In a world where kings collected wives like treasures, their greatest legacy wasn't always empires or monuments. It was succession chaos, sons trained to love each other by day and prepared to kill each other by night. You drift away from the tense corridors of succession, your ears still haunted by whispers of brothers sharpening daggers. But as you step into another wing of the palace, the atmosphere changes again. Here, the air is thick not with politics but with fragrance, overpowering clouds of jasmine, musk, cinnamon, and something sharper that you can't quite place. You cough softly, and a eunuch smirks, as if to say, "Welcome to the laboratory of love." This is where the harem's exotic remedies and potions lived, where women experimented with perfumes, ointments, and stranger concoctions to maintain beauty, win favor, and sometimes manipulate desire itself. You follow the scent deeper into a room lined with shelves. Clay jars, bronze flasks, and glass bottles crowd every surface. Labels are written in delicate calligraphy: rose oil, saffron paste, sandalwood powder. But tucked among them are stranger things: dried lizards, ground pearls, and yes, you spot it, something labelled crocodile dung. You whisper to yourself, well, that's one skincare routine I won't be trying. Here's your mainstream fact. Ancient and medieval cosmetic traditions often involved exotic ingredients. Egyptian and Middle Eastern sources describe women using mixtures of herbs, oils, and minerals, not only for beauty, but also for contraception and aphrodisiacs. Some remedies carried over into Ottoman and Mughal harems, where court physicians supplied elaborate potions for both health and passion. These weren't just spa treatments, they were survival strategies. You watch as an attendant grinds saffron threads into a golden paste. Another sprinkles powdered pearls into a tiny vial of rose water. The result is a shimmering tonic that's supposed to keep skin luminous. One wife dips her fingers in and spreads it across her cheeks, sighing dramatically, as though the glow might earn her another night of a tent. Ion, you smirk, whispering, and I thought my moisturizer was overpriced. But the quirky tidbit here is truly unforgettable. Some sources claim that women used crocodile dung mixed with honey as a contraceptive or a passion charm. The logic? Who knows? Maybe the sheer shock factor was supposed to scare pregnancies away. You chuckle softly. Romance is officially dead when someone pulls out the crocodile poop jar. Perfumes were the most popular weapons of influence. You step past shelves stacked with tiny glass bottles, each sealed with wax. Women dabbed musk behind their ears, ambergris on their wrists, jasmine oil in their hair. The air shimmered with scent trails as wives passed each other, their perfumes declaring rivalry as loudly as any duel. One wife leans toward another and sniffs pointedly, muttering, "Too much cinnamon, darling. You smell like a bakery." You grin, whispering, "Somewhere, a medieval perfumer just lost his star rating." Historians still argue about whether these remedies were effective or symbolic. Did the potions really change moods, inflame passion, or prevent conception? Or were they mostly ritual, giving women a sense of control in a system where control was scarce? Some argue the remedies had genuine medicinal effects. Herbs like saffron and cinnamon did have known properties. Others insist most of it was placebo, the belief more powerful than the brew itself. You glance again at the jar of crocodile dung and mutter, "If that works, then science owes someone an apology." You wander further into the chamber and stumble upon a scene. A group of wives gathered around a physician. He holds up a vial and explains solemnly that it contains powdered emerald mixed with honey, said to cure headaches and bring clarity of thought. One wife tilts her head skeptically, while another eagerly gulps it down. You think, great, so basically they drank gemstones. Talk about expensive medicine. The quirky detail continues when you spot shelves stacked with cosmetics, powders for whitening skin, kohl for lining eyes, crushed beetles for red pigments. Yes, beetles. You lean in and see the tiny containers labelled cochineal. Women dab the powder on their lips, turning them crimson. You whisper, "So next time someone compliments your lipstick, imagine saying, 'Thanks, it's beetle-based.'" The remedies weren't only about beauty, some were protective, even superstitious. A charm made of herbs tied in silk was believed to ward off rivals' jealousy. A talisman with verses inscribed could protect a child from illness. You realize that in the harem, where danger lurked behind whispers and poisoned pastries, remedies weren't just for love, they were for survival. Historians still debate whether these practices were truly rooted in medicine or in magical thinking. Were harems centers of proto-scientific experimentation, or were they more like theaters of superstition? Some argue the blending of remedies shows how science, religion, and magic intertwined in medieval life. Others dismiss many of the records as exaggerated tales from nosy travellers. Standing here, with saffron glowing on one table and dung fermenting on another, you think, why not both? The atmosphere thickens as attendants light braziers, releasing smoke from burning frankincense and myrrh. The room fills with haze, and women drift like ghosts, their robes perfumed, their fingers stained with henna. One dips her hand into a bowl of pomegranate juice to tint her nails, while another experiments with crushed turmeric. You chuckle softly. Basically, this was Sephora with added witchcraft, and yet, beneath the humour you feel the desperation. These remedies were often the only tools wives had to compete for attention. A perfectly applied coal line, a clever perfume mixture, a lucky charm tied to a sash. These might mean the difference between favour and obscurity. You watch one woman clutch a talisman around her neck, whispering a prayer before walking toward the king's chambers, and you realise this isn't vanity, it's survival dressed as beauty. Another quirky tidbit comes from Mughal records. Some wives were given attar of roses stored in silver flasks cooled with snow from the Himalayas. Imagine perfume so precious that it needed a glacier to keep fresh. You grin, whispering, talk about chilled luxury. My fridge barely keeps leftovers edible. Historians still debate whether kings themselves believed in these remedies or merely tolerated them. Some rulers openly indulged, demanding aphrodisiac tonics before visiting the harem. Others scoffed, dismissing the concoctions as women's nonsense. But whether the kings believed or not, the wives certainly did. In a world where their lives depended on catching a king's eye, belief was its own kind of power. As you step back toward the corridor, the scents cling to you: saffron, musk, rose, and something more pungent you'd rather not name. You inhale deeply, dizzy from the cocktail, and think, the harem wasn't just about politics or beauty. It was also an apothecary of survival, where crocodile dung sat beside pearls, where perfumes competed like armies, and where every remedy whispered the same desperate hope. Choose me, remember me, let me live another day in your gaze. The scent of saffron, musk, and that unforgettable crocodile dung still clings to your clothes as you drift back into the harem corridors. But now the air feels sharper, not fragrant, edged. The laughter that floated so freely in the classrooms and courtyards has thinned, replaced by whispers just quiet enough to make you lean closer. You realize quickly, this isn't gossip for fun. This is the stuff of scandal. You sit near a lattice window, the cool marble pressing against your back, and listen. Two attendants huddle close, their voices low but urgent. Did you hear about the cup last night? She swore it tasted bitter. The other gasps, clutching her veil. A poisoned cup. Suddenly the air seems to thicken. You realize that in harems where ambition ran hotter than spices, scandals weren't just entertainment, they were weapons. Here's your mainstream fact. Ottoman and Mughal harems were notorious in historical chronicles for intrigue, scandal, and rumour. Accounts describe alleged affairs between concubines and guards, whispered poisonings of rival wives, and plots hatched in shadowy chambers. Whether all of it happened or not, the perception was powerful. Outsiders loved these stories, and insiders used them as tools. Whispering she's unfaithful could ruin a rival faster than any dagger. You glance into a chamber where a small group of wives recline on cushions, sipping sherbet, their eyes darting like sparrows. One leans in and murmurs, "He stayed in her chambers again last night." Another smirks. The target of the rumour lowers her eyes, saying nothing, but you can feel her pulse racing from across the room. In a harem of 100 women, intimacy wasn't private. It was a battlefield. The quirky tidbit makes you grin, despite the tension. Some travellers wrote exaggerated accounts claiming harems had secret tunnels where illicit lovers sneaked in at night. Were the bong a real? Probably not in the way the gossip described. but the idea was so popular that European readers devoured it like tabloid headlines. You mutter to yourself, so medieval TMZ was basically just harem fan fiction. Still, affairs did sometimes happen. You overhear a eunuch chuckling bitterly about a servant who vanished after rumours spread that she was too close to one of the princes. Nobody asked questions, she was simply gone. You feel a chill. Whether true or false, rumour itself was enough to end lives. Historians still argue how much weight to give these tales. Some insist harems were hotbeds of scandal, their locked doors hiding a storm of jealousy and betrayal. Others argue that much of it was propaganda, stories spread by rivals of empires or by later chroniclers eager to shock their readers. Were these women really poisoning cups, or were their enemies just poisoning reputations? The debate lingers like smoke, impossible to clear completely. You shift into another hall where musicians strum quietly, trying to drown out the whispers. But even here, scandal finds its way. One concubine hides her face behind a fan, her friends pressing closer as she recounts the latest rumour. A princess caught sending secret notes to a nobleman outside. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. The rumour itself is already doing damage. You think, this is less Netflix drama, more live-streamed soap opera. Here's another quirky tidbit. Some harems had official record keepers who noted disputes, punishments, and scandals in logs. Imagine an ancient HR department recording concubine #47 accused concubine #32 of poisoning dessert. Investigation pending. You grin, whispering, imagine explaining that at the staff meeting. The deeper you listen, the more you realize scandal served multiple functions. It was a weapon to destroy rivals, yes, but it was also entertainment. In a confined world where days blurred together, rumors gave life texture. A whispered affair, a poisoned cup, a scandalous note. These were the harem's equivalent of cliffhangers. You watch as women lean forward, eyes gleaming, savoring every detail, and you think, who needs Netflix when you've got 24/7 live gossip? Historians still debate whether these scandals truly influenced politics or just distracted from it. Some argue they had massive consequences, toppling favourites and changing royal decisions. Others insist they were sideshows, dramatised after the fact. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. A poisoned cup might be rumour, but if the king believed it, the result was real enough. You wander into another courtyard just as two wives pass each other. One tilts her chin high, her jewels catching the torchlight. The other mutters something under her breath, and the surrounding women erupt into giggles. It seems harmless, but you know how quickly mockery could spiral into rumour, and rumour into scandal. The harem wasn't just a palace, it was a pressure cooker, and scandal was the steam valve. The quirky detail continues when you overhear a servant describing how perfumes themselves sometimes became part of scandals. One wife accused another of stealing her exclusive rose attar recipe. Another claimed her rival's perfume smelled suspiciously like arsenic. You chuckle, whispering, imagine losing your crown over scented body spray. As the night deepens, the scandals grow darker. You hear of a wife accused of witchcraft, caught burning herbs under the moonlight. Another is whispered to have bribed a guard for forbidden letters. None of it can be proven, but in a world where perception mattered as much as truth, proof wasn't necessary. A rumour once set loose ran faster than any guard could stop it. Historians still argue how much of these witchcraft accusations were real practice versus convenient slander. Some believe women genuinely experimented with herbs and charms, using knowledge passed down through generations. Others suggest these tales were invented to discredit rivals. Either way, you sense the fear in the air. Even a whiff of scandal could stain a woman forever. You step into the shadow of a column, your heart heavy. The laughter, the gossip, the whispers, all of it suddenly feels sharper, more dangerous. In the harem, Every cup could be poisoned, every glance misread, every rumour magnified until it shaped destinies. And as the torches flicker low, you realise the truth. Scandals here weren't just idle talk. They were daggers, sharpened not with steel but with words. The scandals still buzz in your ears. Poisoned cups, whispered affairs, fans hiding smirks. But as you step outside into a breezier gallery, the air shifts again. This hall is filled not with wives or eunuchs, but with foreigners. Merchants, envoys, and travellers lounge on cushions, their robes dusty from long roads, their tongues wagging with stories. They're sipping sherbet, eyes wide with awe or narrowed with suspicion. And you realise you've wandered into a world where the harem isn't just lived. It's described, exaggerated, and exported to audiences far away. You lean against a carved pillar, half hidden, and listen. A Venetian merchant waves his hands dramatically as he speaks. I tell you, I saw it myself. Hundreds of women, each more beautiful than the last, locked behind golden gates. The Sultan strolls among them like a lion among doves. His companions gasp, wide-eyed, as though he's describing paradise. You snort quietly, whispering, either he's exaggerating or he accidentally wandered into a fabric market. Here's your mainstream fact. European travellers from the 16th to 18th centuries often described Ottoman and Mughal harems in letters and books, portraying them as mysterious, decadent, and morally suspect. These accounts heavily shaped Western imagination, giving birth to the enduring stereotype of the Oriental harem as a place of sensual excess. You realise that half the world's image of harems wasn't built on truth, but on second-hand gossip. Nearby, a Persian envoy leans closer to his companions. His version is less glamorous. You think it is paradise? It is prison. The women are trapped, watched night and day. They may have jewels, yes, but freedom? None. His listeners murmur thoughtfully. You nod to yourself, recognizing the irony. One man sees heaven, the other sees a cage. Both are describing the same place. The quirky tidbit surfaces when you hear a French traveller complain loudly about the food. They served me sherbet so cold it gave me a headache. Do you know they actually store ice from mountains just to chill drinks? Madness. You grin, whispering. Congratulations, monsieur, you've just invented the first brain freeze Yelp review. The more you listen, the more you notice how each traveller spins the harem to suit his audience back home. To some, it's a tale of wonder, fountains, silks, women like stars in the sky. To others, it's a cautionary fable of decadence, warning that too much pleasure rots empires. And to others still, it's just exotic entertainment, something to spice up a letter or dazzle readers with scandalous details. Historians still argue how accurate these tales were. Some travellers genuinely glimpsed harems through diplomatic visits, palace tours, or the bragging of servants. Others never got closer than the palace gates, but happily invented whole scenes. Were they eyewitnesses or fabulists? Scholars debate. But you can almost see the smirk on that Venetian merchant's face. You mutter, "Yeah, buddy, no way they let you stroll casually through the women's quarters." You shift closer to another group. A Spanish envoy shakes his head gravely. Mark my words, the harem weakens the sultans. Surrounded by women, drowned in luxury, they lose the strength to rule. That is why the empire crumbles. His audience nods, muttering in agreement. You roll your eyes, whispering, "Sure, blame the women. Forget the wars, the famine, the taxes. It's clearly the cushion's fault." Then you hear laughter from another corner. An English traveller is telling a story about bribing a eunuch to let him peek inside the harem. His listeners gasp and cheer, but you know the truth. That story is almost certainly fiction. Eunuchs weren't exactly handing out backstage passes. Still, the tale earns him admiration, and you realise that for these men, claiming knowledge of the harem was like bragging rights, proof of adventure. The quirky detail grows stranger when one Armenian merchant claims he heard that women in the harem trained pigeons to carry secret love letters beyond the walls. Was it true? Who knows? But the image delights you. Jeweled wives whispering to cooing pigeons, tying notes to their feet. You chuckle, whispering, medieval Tinder, but with bird delivery fees. Historians still debate how much these travelers genuinely misunderstood versus deliberately misrepresented. Some were truly baffled by the cultural differences, while others exaggerated for effect, knowing scandal sold books. The result? A swirl of tales that blurred fact and fantasy until the word harem meant whatever the storyteller wanted it to mean. As you watch the foreigners argue, you realize these stories didn't just entertain, they shaped perceptions. Back in Europe, harems became symbols of the mysterious East, fueling art, literature, and even political rhetoric. Painters filled canvases with half-draped women reclining lazily. Writers penned lurid tales of lust and luxury, and politicians used harems as examples of why Eastern empires were supposedly weaker. You sigh, realizing the irony. The very system built on control and discipline inside the palace was painted abroad as chaos and indulgence. You lean back against the pillar, smiling at the absurdity. One man boasts about fountains of wine flowing in harem gardens. Another insists he heard eunuchs were actual, magical beings who never slept. A third claims wives fought duels with jeweled daggers over the king's attention. You grin, whispering, sounds less like a palace, more like a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. But beneath the exaggeration, you sense a kernel of truth. Foreigners may not have understood the harem, but they understood its importance. They recognized that behind those golden gates, real power was being shaped. Through alliances, whispers, and succession, their stories might have been embroidered, but the fascination they carried proved how central the harem was to the image of empire. Night deepens, and the merchants finish their sherbet. They gather their robes, preparing to leave, still arguing over whether the harem was heaven or hell. You remain in the shadows, thoughtful. To you it feels like both paradise and prison, myth and reality, gossip and politics. And as their voices fade down the corridor, you realize something important. History remembers not only what happened inside the harems, but also how the world imagined them from the outside. The voices of the foreign travelers fade, their tall tales carried down dusty trade routes, and you step once again into the quiet heart of the palace. The corridors feel different now. Where once they rang with laughter, music and gossip, now they echo with absence. The torches flicker against marble walls that seem too big, too heavy for the silence pressing in. You realize you've walked into another stage of this story, the decline. At its height, the harem was a world unto itself. Banquets, jewels, politics, woven through perfume. But empires don't stay golden forever. You wander through an empty courtyard where fountains have dried, their marble basins cracked with neglect. Once wives strolled here in shimmering silks. Now only pigeons strut across the stones. You mutter, talk about downsizing, guess the budget didn't cover fountain maintenance. Here's your mainstream fact. By the 18th and 19th centuries, both the Ottoman and Mughal harems had begun to decline, shrinking in size and importance as empires weakened. The cost of maintaining vast harems became unsustainable. Foreign pressures mounted, and kings were pushed, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by reform movements, towards smaller households, even monogamy. The grand age of hundreds of wives faded like torchlight at dawn. You step into what was once a bustling dormitory of concubines. The cushions are faded, the tiles chipped, the air heavy with dust instead of perfume. The few women who remain sit quietly, sewing in silence. No laughter, no rivalry, no whispered plots, just a sense of waiting for what you're not sure. Maybe for change. Maybe for an ending. The quirky tidbit comes when you overhear an old eunuch reminiscing about the past. In my day, the Sultan had so many wives we needed a separate ledger just for laundry. He sighs, shaking his head. Now he has one wife, maybe two. My job's because Me so boring I'm considering retirement. You grin, whispering. The HR department of love definitely got downsized. But the decline wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Reformers began criticizing harems as symbols of decadence, signs that empires had grown soft. Western influence added pressure too. European diplomats, eager to portray themselves as modern, often mocked the harem system as backward. Kings and sultans, keen to appear enlightened, began shrinking their harems, sometimes even adopting monogamy as a political statement. Historians still argue whether this decline was genuine reform or just cosmetic. Did rulers really believe monogamy was morally superior, or did they simply bow to financial and diplomatic pressure? Some say reformers truly wanted to modernize domestic life. Others argue kings would have happily kept harems if their coffers hadn't run dry. The debate hums like a ghost through the dusty corridors. You walk into the banquet hall, once roaring with feasts. Now, a single table sits in the center, set for only a handful of people. No mountains of lamb, no sugar castles, no jewels scattered like breadcrumbs. Just modest dishes, the kind you might see at any noble household. You think, so basically, the buffet turned into a sad prix-fixe menu. The walls themselves seem to sigh with memory. Paintings of lavish processions peel at the corners. Domes once resounding with music echo with wind. The palace still stands, but its soul feels thinner, like silk frayed at the edges. The quirky detail sharpens when you pass a servant polishing a single silver goblet. He mutters under his breath, "One goblet, one wife, one dinner guest. What do I even do with all this extra silverware?" You smirk, whispering, "Imagine going from cleaning 300 plates to one. That's not downsizing, that's early retirement." As you wander deeper, you realize the decline wasn't only external, it was internal. Without the energy of hundreds of wives, without the gossip and rivalry, the harem lost its political clout. Where once women maneuvered like diplomats, now they sat quietly, sidelined. Some even welcomed the change, glad to be free from the endless rivalries. Others mourned the loss of influence. Historians still debate whether the decline liberated women or erased one of their few avenues of power. Was a quiet harem more peaceful or simply more powerless? You pause in the garden, overgrown now with weeds. A single fountain trickles faintly, its water clouded. You imagine what this space once looked like. Women laughing, children playing, eunuchs patrolling, perfumes rising with the breeze. Now it's just silence and weeds. You sigh, whispering, every empire eventually becomes a ghost story. In another chamber, you overhear an older wife speaking to a younger one. "In my day there were jewels at every feast. Now the king eats plain bread with butter. They say it's healthier." The younger one shrugs, unconcerned. You realize the new generation no longer dreams of fountains of wealth or grand hierarchies. They live smaller, simpler lives, closer to what ordinary families experience. In a strange way, the decline brought normalcy, at least for those who survived the transition. Historians still argue whether the end of the harem era was inevitable. Some say economic strain and Western influence made it unavoidable. Others argue that harems could have survived in smaller forms if not for political reformers eager to erase them as symbols of the old world. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. As you walk back toward the entrance, the palace feels like a hollowed-out shell of its former self. The echoes of laughter and rivalry are gone, replaced by a quieter, gentler rhythm. The king now dines with one wife instead of 100. The eunuchs pace empty corridors, their keys jangling uselessly. The great machinery of the harem has ground to a stop. And as the evening light filters through broken lattice windows, you realize you're witnessing the end of an age. The harem, once a dazzling world of jewels, perfumes, and whispers, has declined into memory. What remains isn't banquets or scandals, but silence and the faint hum of history fading into the night. The palace halls grow quieter still, dust gathering in corners where laughter once clung. You step outside, past faded fountains and shuttered chambers, into the cool air of a world that has moved on. The harem system is gone, or at least no longer the roaring spectacle it once was. But as you walk through city streets centuries later, you realize it never truly disappeared. Its echoes linger, tucked into folklore, carved into museum glass, projected on movie screens. The harem, though silent, still whispers dot. You first notice it in the marketplace. A storyteller sits cross-legged before a crowd, his voice rising and falling as he spins tales. The audience gasps as he describes a great king with 100 wives, each more beautiful than the last, each vying for his attention with cunning schemes. Children laugh, women shake their heads knowingly, and old men nod as if they've seen it all before. You smile, realizing the harem has become a fairy tale template, retold until it's less history and more myth. Here's your mainstream fact. Even after the decline of harems in the Ottoman Empire, their image persisted strongly in literature and folklore. European Orientalist writers in the 18th and 19th centuries especially fueled this memory, publishing novels and paintings that exaggerated the sensual and mysterious aspects of harems. Think reclining women in silks, endless cushions and fountains pouring perfume, images that had little to do with reality, but everything to do with fascination. You wander into a dusty museum next. Behind the glass you see artifacts once used in harems, embroidered slippers, jeweled combs, ivory mirrors. Each object carries a label, a brief description, but you know they carry more than facts. They carry stories. A comb isn't just a comb, it's the echo of a rivalry, a whispered scandal, a mother preparing her son for the throne. A slipper isn't just leather stitched with pearls. It's the sound of footsteps clicking down corridors where whispers decided empires. You lean closer, whispering, if only these shoes could talk, though knowing this palace, they'd probably just spread gossip. The quirky tidbit arrives when you notice an exhibit on historical perfumes. A curator explains that one vial supposedly contains traces of ambergris, a waxy substance from whale stomachs once prized for its scent. You chuckle softly. Imagine discovering your favorite fragrance ingredient is basically whale vomit. The visitors wrinkle their noses, but you know that centuries ago, wives dabbed it proudly, believing it made them irresistible. The harem's beauty rituals, it seems, now live in museum jars. But the harem's echoes aren't only in museums, they're in movies. You sit in a theatre as the screen flickers to life. The film shows kings with glittering turbans, wives lounging on cushions, eunuchs pacing with keys. It's dramatic, colourful, and wildly exaggerated. The audience gasps, laughs, and sometimes scoffs, but they're captivated. You whisper, Hollywood, where one Ottoman harem equals 10 dance numbers and 0 historical accuracy. Historians still argue about these portrayals. Some say they distort history beyond recognition, reducing complex political systems into caricatures of lust and excess. Others argue they at least keep memory alive, ensuring harems aren't forgotten entirely. Is it better to be misremembered than erased? The debate lingers, unresolved. Watching the screen, you sigh. The truth is complicated, but the stories are simple, and people always prefer simple. You step out of the theatre and into the street, where even modern life carries faint echoes. In songs, jokes, and even casual conversation, people still say things like, "What is this? A harem?" when someone seems surrounded by admirers. The word itself has escaped its historical roots and become shorthand for excess. You smirk, whispering, so now harems are metaphors for frat houses and dating shows. Talk about a career downgrade. But not all echoes are shallow. In some regions, folklore still honors women who rose to power through harems, remembering them as queens, mothers, and patrons of art. In Turkey, the legacy of the Valide Sultan is still discussed in history books. In India, Mughal consorts are remembered in architecture they commissioned, mosques, gardens, tombs. Their influence didn't vanish with the decline of harems, it etched itself into stone. You wander through a garden of red sandstone arches and whisper, she may have been hidden behind screens, but her vision is here, still blooming. The quirky detail that makes you grin comes from a modern museum shop. Among the postcards and replicas, you spot a harem perfume for sale, complete with kitschy packaging promising the scent of seduction. You raise an eyebrow, muttering, somewhere a 16th century concubine is rolling in her jeweled grave. It's absurd, but it proves the point. Harems, for better or worse, sell. Historians still debate what to do with this memory. Should harems be studied as sites of oppression, prisons gilded with jewels, or as centres of female influence where women navigated impossible constraints with cunning and power? The arguments go on because memory itself is a battlefield. Folklore leans romantic, films lean scandalous, museums lean factual, but no single version tells the whole story. As evening falls, you stroll past another storyteller in the square. This one recites a tale of a clever queen mother who saved her son's throne with nothing but wit and whispered words. The audience cheers, inspired. You realize the harem lives on not only in scandal and exaggeration, but also in admiration. For resilience, intelligence, and survival. You pause under a lantern, the glow soft against your face. The harem is gone, its walls broken, its courtyards overgrown, but in stories, in museums, in films, and OKs, it still lingers. Memory reshapes it, sometimes unfairly, sometimes flatteringly, but always insistently. The echoes may be distorted, but they're loud enough that centuries later you can still hear them. And as the lantern flickers in the night, you whisper to yourself, history fades, but myths echo forever. You step through the last corridor of the palace, your sandals brushing against marble tiles that have borne centuries of secrets. The air feels cooler now, as if the building itself exhales after holding its breath for too long. You pause at the threshold, glancing back at the halls you've wandered. Torchlit banquets, jeweled cushions, whispers behind screens, poisoned cups, and perfumes both divine and ridiculous. It feels impossible that all of it once coexisted under one roof, yet here you are, standing on the edge of its dreamlike exit. A gate swings slowly open, creaking as though reluctant to let you go. Beyond it lies the night air, soft, expansive, free of jasmine perfume and the weight of jewels. As you step out, the palace begins to shrink behind you, not in size, but in presence, fading into something that feels less like history and more like memory. You mutter, like a party you barely survived, except this one lasted 500 years. Here's your mainstream fact. By the early 20th century, harems had largely disappeared as formal institutions, especially after the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922. What lingered were fragments, memories in folklore, artifacts in museums, and exaggerated tales in novels and films. The once mighty system of hundreds of wives reduced to echoes carried on the wind. You glance back at the domes, silhouetted against the stars, and whisper, from empire's heartbeat to tourist attraction, talk about a career change. The quirky tidbit makes you chuckle as you pass a guardhouse near the gates. Old records suggest that some harems employed parrots trained to mimic human voices, supposedly to confuse outsiders or to entertain children. Imagine walking by the palace walls at night and hearing a parrot squawk, "The king snores too loud." You grin, whispering, "Forget spies, just unleash a gossiping parrot." The scholarly debate still lingers. Even as you drift into the night, were harems dens of oppression, gilded cages suffocating women under silk? Or were they paradoxical sanctuaries, where women wielded influence through whispers, education, and resilience. Historians still argue, their voices overlapping like rival wives in the same chamber. Perhaps the truth is both, a system of confinement that also became a stage for survival, politics, and sometimes power. You walk further into the night, the sound of the city surrounding you. Merchants call, dogs bark, a flute plays somewhere in the distance. Compared to the palace, it feels humble, yet alive. You realize that outside the harem's walls life always moved on, oblivious to the whispers of queens and concubines. Empires rose and fell, but bread was still baked, streets still bustled, stars still shone overhead. You smile softly. Turns out history is both palaces and potholes. As the palace fades behind you, you feel yourself floating, as though you're no longer walking but gliding. The torchlight you once followed has transformed into moonlight, gentle and pale. Each step takes you further from jeweled banquets and closer to silence. You imagine the wives, the eunuchs, the princes, all fading into mist, their voices blending into one collective sigh that drifts into the night sky. Yet echoes cling. You can still smell faint rose water, hear the distant pluck of a lute, sense the soft rustle of silk. The harem may have declined, collapsed, and been repackaged as folklore, but its essence lingers, woven into memory. You whisper, history is like perfume. Sometimes the bottle is gone, but the scent hangs in the air. You pause on a hill outside the palace walls. The domes gleam faintly, their outlines shimmering like a mirage. You realize you've walked through centuries in a single night, tracing the arc from torchlit palaces bursting with wives to empty corridors echoing with dust. And now, as dawn begins to break, you feel the story itself dissolving, like smoke curling into sky. The palace is behind you now, shrinking into the haze of memory. The road before you stretches quiet and open, bathed in the silver wash of moonlight. Your steps slow, your breathing deepens, and the frantic noise of harems, laughter, quarrels, gossip, music melts into a soft hum, as if the world itself is asking you to rest. The air is cooler here, unperfumed, carrying only the faint scent of night flowers. You pause for a moment and tilt your head toward the sky. Stars glitter like scattered jewels, simpler, purer than any emerald or pearl locked in palace vaults. You realize how small the grand halls seem now compared to the vast dome above you. The harems, with all their splendor and sorrow, were just one thread in history's tapestry. The sky has always been larger, quieter, eternal. Your body begins to sink into comfort. Each memory of torchlight and silk fades gently into the background, leaving only calm. The voices that once whispered urgently in darkened halls now whisper kindly, their edges softened, their urgency dissolved. You picture the wives setting aside rivalry, the eunuchs laying down their keys, the princes releasing their daggers, all of them finally at peace, dissolving into starlight. The path beneath you feels softer, as though it carries you rather than resisting you. The world is no longer crowded with noise or schemes. It is spacious, slow, forgiving. You allow yourself to drift, to imagine lying back on cool grass, the earth supporting you, the sky embracing you. And as your eyelids grow heavier, you know the story has ended, but its echoes, like faint perfume, will linger in your dreams.